Author Alan Byrne is a first-time guest. He's got a brand new book out now on the late, great Phil Lynott called Philip Lynott, Renegade. Welcome to the podcast, Alan.
Thanks a million, Eric. Appreciate it.
Before we get to the book, tell us how you became a fan of Phil Lynott.
Sure. Well, Lizzy really were always in my house growing up. So it's really, when you start getting into music and taking an interest, I suppose before you have money to buy your own stuff or to buy whatever is contemporary, you just go with, what's in your house, what's in your friend's house and everything like that, really. And I had Lizzy on tap in my house growing up.
It's important to know, where did you grow up?
I grew up in a place called Carrigaline, County Cork, which is way down south in Ireland.
Yeah, I say that because here in the States, it's a big difference. Thin Lizzy here and Thin Lizzy in Ireland, it's much different. We were just chatting about that before we started recording. Why isn't this band more known here in the States? People know Thin Lizzy for The Boys Are Back in Town. Jailbreak gets play on the rock radio stations in the States. Yeah. But you look at the body of work there, I mean, there are plenty of songs that could have been huge hits on the radio, maybe not necessarily crossover top 40 singles, maybe, but certainly rock radio singles. And it's still, it's one of those things that's kind of mind-boggling, like why it never happened.
Yeah, they went out there, they were in 75, they're 76, 77. They did go out there on tour. I think the last time was in 1980. But they always had problems. Phil got, particularly if you're talking about, the Boys Are Back in Town, that era. They did a bit of the tour and then they were adding dates to it and continuing. And Phil got hepatitis. The next time, Brian Robertson injured his hand before going on a tour. By luck, I think they ended up going out in 1977 with Queen after attended, I think it was a Day at the Races, the Queen album launch. And one thing led to another, and they ended up going out to the States maybe 6 weeks later than planned. But, Phil got hepatitis. However he got that is open to debate. So, Robbo injured his hand. Gary Moore later walked out. So I'm not sure if you can totally call what happened with them in the States bad luck. If they had booked tours and they were meant to go out there, then people are eventually going to doubt that they're going to turn up. And, that's kind of what happened.
There was an original edition of this book, came out in 2012. Tell us about what's in this brand new edition, which you say is remixed and reconfigured.
Yeah, the original book came out in 2012. It was done by an Irish publisher. It was only published actually in Ireland in terms of being on the bookshelves. It wasn't on bookshelves anywhere else, but, you got it online. What we did basically was we had a look at, I linked in with this publisher, Sonic Bond. Stephen Lamb is the main guy there. And we just he came up with a few suggestions in terms of what we can do to kind of, not necessarily update it, but kind of revise it and kind of refocus some of the coverage on it. Because it's really a book about, even though it's Phil, it's not Lizzy focused as much as the other books. It's really about the success when Lizzy became successful commercially and were solid in that respect. He would then go off and do all these other things, and he very quickly did that with Jeff Wayne in 1976. So it was really about just kind of, I had, shall we say, collected new material from people who worked with Phil outside of Lizzy. And particularly the second half of the book, it's just about refocusing some aspects, particularly the collaborations he was doing, also stuff with video directors, and, kind of re-looking as well at Grand Slam and, what really was Grand Slam, was it a half-hearted effort or kind of a wholehearted, but just didn't get the reaction they needed.
That was his first solo band, Grand Slam?
Or Grand Slam happened after Lizzy, for
first post Thin Lizzy solo.
Yeah, so they did all these. I think there could be upwards of about 25 to 30 tracks, somewhere around there, and they've never done really anything with them. Bar Dedication, that song came out in 1991, I think. So they, when I say they, I just mean his estate, or they haven't. They haven't done anything. They've decided not to, I suppose.
Going back to the early days now, the Thin Lizzy producer, John Alcock, wrote the foreword to the first edition, and it's included in the new edition. And he said, quote, "How much insight would it give to the reader on Phil's background and how his earlier life shaped this man who would become a poet, rocker, lyricist, and driving force behind the preeminent Irish rock band. The answer was a lot. The first few chapters reveal details of his background and influences, of which I had no clue. So, talk about that. When and where was Phil born? What was his life like growing up?
Well, yeah, well, Phil was born in West Bromwich in England, kind of Birmingham area, I think that area. So he spent, he was born there, but his mom, I suppose, has written her book and documented the tough, times that she would have endured. He was still over there. I think he was over there for 5 or 6 years or something. But she did. I remember her telling me, she made the phone call home and asked her own mum if she would take Phil in and raise him in her home in Dublin. So, and that's what happened. Over the course of like many years of research, because I've done a couple of other books on Lizzie and Phil, and his childhood appears to have been, quite a happy one. I've since kind of read in other places that he would have, he certainly would have stuck out as one of the few people of color, I suppose, in Dublin or Ireland at that time. But that, as his mum told me, I think that made him feel more special in some respects. That he was, that he was different, but he was also, a member of family in Dublin.
He also literally stood out, right? How tall was he? He was tall.
I think he was about 6 foot, 6'1" or somewhere
Okay.
around. But then, of course, he had the boots, always
Right.
these flowing jackets as well. He had, and of course, the hair.
Couldn't miss
Um,
him.
so, I do remember his mom actually saying that to me. I think they were on holiday somewhere, and she'd be sitting on the sunbed, and he'd arrive over. And there was a couple of times I think maybe he had a Walkman and he, was playing her some tracks that he was working on or something. But she did recall just, this hulking, if you can imagine it, with the cowboy boots and all the gear, walking over poolside with, have to listen to this, see what you think. But yeah, she did. Yeah, this kind of hulking. So he was about 6 foot, but I mean, add to it all the paraphernalia, as it
He
were.
had the rock star presence
Oh
from
yeah,
early on. We're recording this on a Saturday, so he probably would be at the cinemas right now if, as a kid, right? Talk about how the movies influenced his early artistic ambitions when he was a kid.
yeah. They were all obsessed. I think it's one of the things certainly here in Ireland. I can relate to that hugely because it was a weekly thing, or even sometimes during the week. It's the ultimate escapism, really, isn't it? You're going to the cinema, you have the cinema scope, everything, heroes on the big screen kind of thing. And you can hear everything, of course, came from America, largely, if you were going to the cinema. And he had the luck as well when you're living in Dublin, because back then, films often took, it's only when they ran out of audience in Dublin that a lot of these films traveled to other cinemas across the country. So somebody could be watching, let's say, The Godfather. I do remember hearing that story from a few people. The Godfather, let's say, was playing in Dublin in January, for instance, and it didn't come down to Cork until the summer. So he would have had the first dibs, or anybody else in Dublin, for looking at these, cinematic heroes on the big screen. You can hear a lot of influence. You can hear him singing, actually. You can hear him and how America influenced him. His enunciation, I think, which you'll hear quite a lot of with the stripped back versions. They did a box set there a couple of months back with the Jailbreak and Johnny the Fox albums. And they've stripped back a few of the songs, and he sings in a very American way.
The songs seem to be story driven, right?
Very much
Character
so. Yeah.
driven, like a movie, like a mini movie.
Absolutely, yeah. Lyrically, he did that, and I think a bit of that got lost later on. But he certainly did that. There's very strong storytelling in that. Certainly in the Decca period with Eric Bell, very naive, kind of youthful storytelling. But then when they go to the four piece and America hits him like a hammer, I suppose, you can definitely hear the changes happening. And it's interesting. There's so many different iterations of Lizzie.
How far back does it go in terms of his poetry? When did he start doing
Well,
that?
he would have started going. So, like he was a teenager doing that in Dublin. Like when you think of it too, like he was in his first band when he was 13 or 14, you know,
Was that the
and being
Black Eagles?
like Eagles, yeah.
Yeah.
So I mean, he's been ferried around by the dad of two of the other band members, and they've been driven around. They're on the circuit. They're getting a taste for what all this is about. That must have been an incredible experience.
You do talk about the Black Eagles and how it had a positive impact
Mm.
on him. You said the positive impact that the Black Eagles experience had on Philip in his apprenticeship as a singer can't be overstated. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, because number one, it's not an easy thing to do to get up and perform. He wasn't naturally, and you'll see that in the early Lizzy stuff, a frontman. He was certainly in that early period. He had these. He was using all these gimmicks. He'd have like something like Michael Jackson did much later on. With the glove, and the sparkly glove and all this kind of thing. They had particular outfits and all that kind of thing. But somebody said to me, the most curious of people, that kind of way, down in the markets, getting in touch with clothing. And because Jesus, he always dressed superbly, no matter what part of his life. He was always very keen in that sense. But the Black Eagles, as an apprenticeship, had to have been, you're getting the greatest of experiences. You're being ferried around. You're with, lads your own age. You're a teenager. So, but he was just out front singing. He wasn't playing an instrument or anything like that.
Yeah, that's right. He wasn't playing bass at that time.
No, no, long. That's a few years away yet.
But
Um,
he was getting noticed. I mean, he was fairly popular in the area, right? He was
well, he's very popular with the girls.
right.
And I think, as time went on, because they didn't really go outside of Dublin too much. So, plus they'd have school the next day. So, it's bizarre to think of it that, kind of 14, 15 and 16 and all that kind of thing, and you're out and about. But I mean, he would have left school as a teenager anyway, and, started to as you were talking earlier about the poetry scene, and he hooked up with like-minded people. Tim Booth from a band called Doctor Strangely Strange, and he would go to readings that were held in various pubs in and across the city. So there was a combination of very different things going on with the poetry, and sometimes he would sit in with an acoustic guitar and just gig for a couple of pints and a packet of crisps.
It's while Phil's in a band called Orphanage with drummer Brian Downing that he meets a guitarist named Eric Bell. He's looking to form a band inspired by Cream and Jimi Hendrix. Can you tell us about how this leads to the formation of Thin Lizzy?
Yeah, well, you've got Eric Bell, who's at this point in time he's playing in a show band. Show band is basically in Ireland a particular sensation in the 1960s. Well, still around, I suppose, in some respects. But he was in a band called the Dreams, and but they play covers. A show band basically is a covers band, but they play what would be top 40 hits of the day. That's essentially what show bands did. They cornered a particular circuit in Ireland, which were the ballrooms. You might so they held a decent quantity, capacity, I should say, for people. You might get 1,000 in there. You could get more. So Eric, but the thing, there's a repetitive nature to that. Playing top 40 songs, or certainly, you certainly didn't play any original material. That just it wasn't the focus of what those bands were to do. So that left bands like The Orphanage or any other band really who were trying to perform original material. That left them really with the pubs and the club circuits. So the capacities here, the fall offs are, they're huge in terms of the amount of people you'll get into these places. But Eric Bell essentially just decided, I don't want to do this anymore, and quit the Dreams, gave him his notice. They used to call a job in the show bands a job for life, like the civil service or something like that. But he did recall that the manager was very, very of the manager of the Dreams was quite a nice about it, and gave him an amp. Like Eric Bell didn't have his own amp, when he left. To how are you going to form a band? Do you own your own guitar? Do you have an amp? Do you have any idea who you want in your band? No.
Mm.
So I mean, it's the ultimate in dreaming, and hoping. But he did that. He went around and started hanging around the pubs and clubs where original musicians or bands performing original material were playing. And ultimately, I'd say towards the end of his patience, and certainly his budget, because he did always say that he was running out of money. And, it was just, I think Brian Downey wasn't initially interested, and Phil called him back and said, look, let's give it a go.
Under one condition, right? Phil said, "I got to write some songs. You gotta let me have some participation here."
Yeah, and he was learning to play bass at that point, but he also wanted to play bass. So
That was the other thing. Yeah.
talk about, I don't want to say the stars aligning, but Eric Bella always said, Thin Lizzy was meant to be. One person who's sitting around on his night off, his only night off of the week, I think a Monday, decides, I want to do something completely different musically. So Eric Bell is the trigger for Thin Lizzy. He's the guy who's setting things in motion. And upon chatting and meeting Phil and Brian Downey, but also Eric Rickson, the keyboard player, who joined them for a short time, for maybe 6 months.
Mentioned the lyrics, Phil's lyrics, that he could create characters like what he would see in films, but he also injected his firsthand experiences into them. And you cite the song Little Girl in Bloom as an example in the
Yeah,
book of this. Talk about that particular song and why you zeroed in
yeah.
on that one.
It's always very interesting to listen to that era of Thin Lizzy. It's a great, if you have the time or make the time kind of thing, to listen to the first album. You have an EP, I think, in between the second album. If you listen to them consecutively, there's a lovely picture painted of just as third, because they're all Phil's lyrics, so the story of his life. You know, you don't really get, in certain bands, individual credits come into it. As a writer, they also write the lyrics, but Thin Lizzy was Phil's lyrics, so he's writing his own life, so we don't really get a perspective on the other band members as much as we do on Phil. But Little Girl in Bloom could be, I've often felt, it's Phil speaking to his own mother, but also possibly because at the time when he was a teenager, he was in a relationship and had a child with that girl. That child was put up for adoption, and maybe she too was the little girl in bloom. He could be wonderfully ambiguous with his lyrics, and you can't say it's about that person, but you also can't say it's not about that person. So I think that's a skill that he just got better and better and better at.
I just added it to the playlist here because I put together a playlist of songs for the episode, and that's one that I've got in there. That's the same album. Well, that's from the same album as Whiskey in the Jar, Randolph's Tango, The Rocker,
That era, yeah, the Vagabonds album,
Vagabonds. Yep.
which is great. They released a box set of that, I think around November 2023 or thereabouts. So it's an expanded set of that album with artwork, additional artwork. That would have been the first album where Jim Fitzpatrick came in and did the cover, which is, I think, one of their better ones.
Yeah, it's a cool cover. What do you
Yeah,
think of the first album? That's the self-titled one from '71. The Farmer was, I think, a single, but the one that stood out to me, I think, most that sounded maybe most Thin Lizzy like was "Look What the Wind Blew In," or at least in terms of what they would become.
that's it. You see, I'm not sure if that's the way to look at those albums. I
Different
always
sound.
completely different band, really. And I've often, just chatting with friends, or if we're in Dublin at the Vibe or something like that, there is that thing of comparing the Eric Bell era sound or songs with the more aggressive Thin Lizzy that started from Nightlife in 1974 on. And it's not. I think it needs to be seen or viewed and listened to by itself, and not. It's just. It's. I don't. It's not
It's more
comparable.
folk, right?
It is, yeah, and it's like, as you said there. Look what the wind blew in. There is that aggression with it. Great song, but again, it's quite different to, I think, anything that came after. I think the closest thing that that between that initial Thin Lizzy and I suppose what people call the classic years of with Robertson and Gorham, you've got a couple of singles there in between, The Rocker, Little Darling. They're kind of the songs that are gravitating towards where Phil's writing was going. But the other things, I always feel that they should just be looked at nearly separately to what Thin Lizzy became for the last 10 years.
The pinnacle of their early success was with 1972's Whiskey in the Jar. That's a cover.
Yeah.
Went to number 6 in the UK, but no matter what they tried, they couldn't follow up with another hit single for a while. 5 records. They're still feeling that pressure to come up with a big selling album, a big single for the radio. Now under Vertigo Records, they know the final album under their contract had to deliver. And they delivered with 76's Jailbreak, which includes the title track and the huge single, The Boys Are Back in Town. This is where we need to talk about producer John Alcock and his influence. What was it that he did for the band, and Phil in particular, that made the difference?
Just to wind it back just slightly, with Vagabonds, it took 3 albums to get to kind of what is probably the pinnacle of the Eric Bell era albums. You know, first album I quite like, second one, parts of it. I think Vagabonds is a superb album. Thin Lizzy then regroup after Eric leaves. It then takes them another 3 albums, or 2, you know, the 2 where they're finding their feet, and on the third, just I think like on the third album of the Decca deal, they hit, and they hit quite big. The same could be applied, you know, in terms of that sequence for the lead up to The Boys Are Back in Town. John Alcock was, well, he was a producer who had kind of pedigree. He had worked with The Who. He had worked, I think, a lot with John Entwistle. He was someone who basically Phil would kind of have to answer to. I think Phil always worked best with somebody who had chops, as it were. Like later on a bit, Visconti, when Lizzy did the albums with Visconti. Visconti was a very successful producer, you know, and arguably didn't need Thin Lizzy on his CV. And therefore, to my mind, their best work was produced with people who were as good, if not better, than them at what they did. They also made a couple of key decisions, particularly Alcock. You know, they did the meetings. He met Phil. He played him a bunch of demos. So Alcock determines, you know, is there an album there? Have you got the songs in place? Phil's writing at this point is very different to even Nightlife. You know, it has jumped on quite significantly. It's getting that bit more aggressive. But John Alcock, you know, he goes and sees the band. They get on, but they also do another key thing, I think, which is he takes the band out to Ramport Studios, which was outside London. So there's no distractions there, you know, and they're in what was then a very rundown part of London. There's one pub locally, and if they want to blow off steam, they walk up the road to that pub. They're not going anywhere else. So the focus, like Jailbreak, was recorded, I think, in about 6 weeks. You know, it's something ridiculous when you think of how that kind of thing has changed in Def Leppard or someone. Do they take 4 or 5 years? I wonder.
Guns N' Roses, the famous story with Chinese Democracy.
Jesus Christ. I mean, that was, what's that, 12, 13 years? In the
Something like that. Yeah.
And I remember when I bought it and I heard it and I was like, fuck, that shouldn't have taken that long, you know? I remember, geez, that's a perfect example. You know, so they're sitting in, they're focused, but they also know what's coming if they don't get it together.
The pressure, yeah, because they would have been let go, not re-signed.
Exactly. You know, and that was absolutely the case. But then, you know, sometimes maybe they were at that point, you know, Phil is he's 25, 26 years of age, and he's the oldest. So the other lads, you know, maybe do you feel that pressure at that age, or do you just kind of concentrating maybe too much on what you're doing, and then maybe it's on reflection you see, holy shit, we pulled it out of the bag, you know?
I think that age of 30 is when you start getting closer to that. You're thinking, is this where I'm supposed to be? Is this the direction I'm supposed to go in? Maybe I need to change. But then Boys Are Back in Town, of course, we know what happens. And that's a perfect example of a song that was only partially complete before entering the studio. Can you talk about how this song comes to be in the studio, and what was it before that? I think half the song was done, you say in the book?
Yeah, because I mean, well, you could argue that was the case for most of the tracks, but they've demoed X amount of songs, and certainly more than were on the album. But they also have carryover from previous sessions. As far as I can remember, I think they were playing the riff for Johnny the Fox, and Johnny Fox meets Jimmy the Weed. I think they were messing around with that in 1974, and there's some stuff after which I think is Dancing in the Moonlight. They were messing around with that during the Johnny the Fox sessions. They brought the boys are back in town. I mean, there's so many stories about that, and that it wasn't necessarily considered for inclusion on the album, but that would be in its unfinished state. We have no idea just how advanced whatever recording they would have made. Most likely, basic backing tracks and maybe a guide vocal to even parts of it. And I wonder if that's what Chris O'Donnell, one of their managers at the time, would have heard. Well, the story goes that he liked it and asked them to develop it and consider including it on the album.
Was
But
this
then,
about when the band would come back after a tour? The boys are back in town, or is it about the life on the road?
but again, we're going back to Phil and leaving it kind of open ended. The boys are back in town is, I think, as much about Thin Lizzy and about their fans as it is about anything you'd like it to be. A bunch of people have been away, as you said, on the road. It could be
So
Thin Lizzy.
yeah, they're
Yeah,
back in your town. The
yeah,
boys aren't back in their town; they're back in your town. They're ready to play. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. Or party.
He also came up with lyrics last minute. Isn't that what you were saying in the book? Most of the time, he would wait until the end.
He would. It's quite funny actually when you hear certain things. I think you'll be able to hear them on the various kind of deluxe editions or box sets that they've been putting out for the last 10 years or so, and you'll find lyrics from. You can go to live recordings even. You'll find lyrics from. I think they did. They released something. It was called Live in Derby. Derby Live in. I think it is. It's from 19. It's on the Fighting Tour, and it's leading up to just before the sessions for what became the Jailbreak album. But there's a song, is it Still in Love with You? I think is the song that they play in this on this live album. But he ends up singing verses that he would later use in, I think it's the With Love track from the Black Rose album. There's lyrics for Lizzy songs that were outtakes from 1974. I think for the Fighting or Nightlife or Fighting album. It's a song called Leaving Town, and it's that. I think it's Fighting that might have been a reject for, but they never released it anyway. But he disassembled the lyrics from Leaving Town and he dispersed it in these various other songs, which is fascinating and to very good effect.
We mentioned he was under a lot of pressure at that time. Is this
Yeah.
when his alcohol and drug abuse start to worsen?
I wouldn't say that, but the more success you have in that industry, the more that kind of thing is going to, there's more doors opening, there's more opportunity. So, I mean, it's up to you whether you want to, say yes or say no or whatever you want to do. But like Lizzie, they were never clean living guys really per se. So but as you do in your 20s, I think, and certainly with the opportunities that came their way, they were doing what everybody else was doing in that industry at that time.
Yeah, I think it's more when he gets married and has a child, then the responsibilities are added, I think, right? Because you say when responsibility came knocking, he frequently chose not to answer the door. And this is in reference to his growing drug habit, an attempt to escape the responsibilities that encircled him. And can you expand on that? Why do you think that was? Where did that self destruction come from?
Well, to begin with, I think he was probably, Phil died in 1986. He had hepatitis in 76. Like he was probably hitting it hard for 10 years. But, you dabble, where's the line or where comes the point whereby you're no longer in control of what you're doing? I think there was a lot of things kind of coalesced, particularly after Black Rose. If you take the Chinatown album from 1980, I can like it and I can also be very frustrated with it. I don't understand quite a lot of the marketing of what they were up to back then. Like they released a single, I think in the spring of 1980. The album didn't come out, I think, until October 1980. They released another single as a taster. I think that was Killer on the Loose.
That was the second single, I think. The title track was the first one.
The first one, yeah. So if the first, if Chinatown as a single came out in spring thereabouts 1980, they then release another single, and then the album follows, and then there's no more. So there's no sustain. There's no way that for them to sustain the album. So the album kind of, even though it went top 10 in the UK, it didn't really hang around as long as Black Rose. At that point, you've also got Snowy White in the band. After Robbo's gone, Gary Moore is gone. There's a few people come in. Bijur came in for a little bit. Dave Flett from Manfred Mann came in, and you've got a lot of disorder. And it's really from there on, there doesn't seem to be the growth that you saw between 1974 and 1978, 79. It just becomes something a little bit different.
Snowy White's interesting. I don't know if there's ever been a book on him, but that was around the time he was in Pink Floyd too, 1980. He was on the Wall
Yeah,
tour.
yeah. Well, I love some of the stuff that he did
Yeah.
with and as you say, it's funny, he's a blues guitar player. Eric Bell is a blues guitar player, so they kind of go less for the aggressive Robbo and Gorham combo, and then Gorham and Gary Moore. So they kind of revert, but it doesn't really work, commercially at least. But some great songs in Chinatown, and equally the Renegade album.
Yeah, the title track to Chinatown is great.
Yeah, yeah, and it's
Killer on the Loose.
They're I think if you look at it and you're like, what would be the third single to help sustain that album? I'm not entirely sure, but maybe We Will Be Strong or Hey You or something like that.
Yeah, Hey You and We Will Be Strong, at least according to Wikipedia. That's the chronological order there. Author Alan Byrne, brand new book. Philip Lynott, Renegade, the late great Philip Lynott. Interesting, the title Philip, because everybody calls him Phil. Was there a reason behind the full first name?
Yeah, the majority of people I've ever spoken to called him Philip. So
Okay.
it's which was always interesting to me. His mom, it was Philip. If you listen to Jim Fitzpatrick, it's Philip. But there's plenty who called him Phil as well. Certainly in just conversations I had with him. But a load of people said Philip. And there's a few stories as well saying that he didn't particularly like being called Phil. I preferred Philip.
He preferred Philip. Like Eddie Van Halen always said, I prefer Edward. Call me Edward. Yeah. Before I ask you about Philip's solo work, what led to the end of Thin Lizzy in 1983? I think maybe you were kind of going there. Maybe they reached their creative plateau.
Well, if going back to marketing again, in some respects, Renegade was recorded. I think the first sessions of Renegade were at your direction. They were out in Compass Point, that famous studio out in NASA.
That's where AC/DC recorded Back in Black. Yeah.
Grace Jones, I think, did some of her most famous stuff out there. But they were essentially, Phil and Lizzy went out there a few times. They were in there, I think, 1978, 1979, and 1981. And 1981 January, they went out and there was a few of them, not all of them, and a few of them went out. And they did what were mainly ended up being Phil solo songs, or I don't think some of them were released at all. So you've got the Renegade sessions take place throughout the year, and they release it later in 81, but there's no single. There's no single preceding the album. I think the first single from it came out months after it. I think it was maybe 3 months, 4 months. And that single, of course, went nowhere. It certainly didn't make the top 40. I think it was 50 out of 53 or 4 or something like that. And the song was Hollywood. So if you look at the album, I'm not sure if there's a single on it. So it doesn't surprise me. So
I think that was the only single release from it.
It has. And so to release your lead single 3 months or 4 months after the album has been released, I mean, that's, commercially, that it just doesn't make any sense. So there's that. So, but ultimately, that album was a commercial failure upon release. A band like Lizzy couldn't afford that in any way. But Chinatown wasn't as popular as the previous album. Renegade was less popular than Chinatown. It was at that point you had Kit Wolven, the engineer on everything, I think, from Life and Dangerous onward. Kit had a conversation with Philip in the Odyssey recording studio. I think they were in the canteen, were waiting for another band to come out. And Kit basically was frustrated and said it to Phil, what are we doing today? Because Phil, at that point, you wouldn't know whether he wanted to work on Lizzy stuff or solo stuff, or even identify, well, what is a Lizzy track at this point and what is a solo track. So he was frustrated because he didn't know which way to approach the sessions. Phil reacted quite bluntly and asked him, what do you prefer? Kit said, well, the solo stuff is more interesting. He said, fine, you're off the album. Now, at this point, Kit had recorded the majority of that Lizzy album, Renegade. But Chris Tangarides was brought in to finish it off. So I think Chris did 3 of the 9 songs, but you'll see the end credit was Chris Tangarides. But he then continued to work with them on for what would be the last album. So I think, you were asked what led to the end of Lizzy. Commercially, they had run their course. Their last singles weren't successful. I think the last single they put in the top 20 may have been the EP. I think the Are You Ready?
Were they headlining at the time? Were they opening for acts?
Yeah, no, they were headlining, but
yeah,
they'd been playing the same venues. So they weren't really after getting any bigger. They never toured America after the Chinatown album because there was never, Renegade didn't do well in England. It was far less successful. There was no need to go to America to try to promote an album that people didn't appear to have any interest in. The same applied for Thunder and Lightning. The chart placement just didn't justify. If they went out there, they would have been losing money.
Let's talk about his work outside of Thin Lizzy. The book really sheds light on this aspect of his career, which is often overlooked. What were the projects that he was able to record as a solo artist before his passing?
Well, he did the first solo album when Lizzy that kind of comes into it as well, I suppose, during Chinatown. Chinatown sessions began January 1980. So they were recording Chinatown tracks. They stopped doing that and they started prepping Phil's first solo single, Dear Miss Lonely Hearts. So you've got all this kind of thing going on, which griped, I think, with some other band members. Lizzy recording time ended up being used for Phil's solo recording time. So you've got situations there where members of the band really, I suppose, should have been paid session fees. But there was, he was mixing, taking advantage of the situation, I think, perhaps. So he put out his first solo album in 1980. Another one followed in 1982. Solo in Soho was 1980. The Philip Lynott album was 1982. And that essentially is the end of albums, really, from Phil outside of Lizzy. So there
was a photo in the book, though, of him and Huey Lewis in 1985, I think. Was he working on something at that time, and then Huey was going to be part of that album?
Exactly.
Because there's a great story about Huey being on the live album.
Yeah.
Because Huey was in Clover. Yeah, he's on that album, and he's on one of the tracks, and Phil introduces him.
Yeah, Bluesy Huey.
Yeah, Bluesy Huey. Yeah. But yeah, I'm sorry, I interrupted you there. But yeah, that photo, so what's the story behind that one?
That is in the Record Plant studio. Is it in San Francisco?
Huey's got his little baby girl there on his lap. I think his daughter was just born.
That's Huey's daughter, yeah. The story with that was Phil basically went out. Phil at that point is beyond Grand Slam. So Thin Lizzy end in autumn '83. Grand Slam started recording their songs in December '83, and by December '84 they played their last gigs. So January '85, Phil is basically getting a favor from Huey to go out to do a couple of tracks. Phil at that point is looking around for his own deal, his own solo deal. He brings the Grand Slam guitar player with him, Lawrence Archer, but there's problems there because he's been arrested for drug possession and stuff, and he's having problems traveling. His visas are being cancelled, and he's losing his passports frequently. But he manages anyway. Lawrence Archer flew out, so it wasn't any original writing. Essentially, they re-recorded a Clover track called "Still Alive," and they also did a Grand Slam track called "Can't Get Away." There was meant to be more. But, Phil, due to the problem, like Lawrence Archer went out ahead, Phil followed, I think, a week or so later. At the time, Huey Lewis was recording that We Are the World charity single. So I think they only had what should have been, I think, about 10 days in the studio. I think they only had 3 or 4, something like that. So there wasn't, the songs, even though you'll find them on YouTube, I mean, they're nearly finished. They're nearly there. But they sound like Huey Lewis songs. They've done the deluxe editions and the box sets for Thin Lizzy. but they've done nothing with the solo albums. Even the second solo album has, I think it had, there's as many tracks left off it as there were on it, or certainly approaching that. You know? There's only one way to try to promote, any material like that. You'd need to reissue it and perhaps consider including, there's a different version of that second solo album because it's, even though it's called the Philip Lynott album, it was originally called Fatalistic Attitudes after one of the tracks. It had a different track listing. There's a couple of tracks that he decided not to include, which baffled me.
Great
It,
tracks.
Interesting tracks, very uncommercial, like somebody else's dream. I think is quite a good track. That Gino could be included on any album. I just don't get the track. I don't. There's another one, Don't Talk About Me, Baby. They're very lazy songs to me. I don't. They're B sides or outtakes. He did a version of Dirty Old Town during those album sessions. He did collaborations with Jerome Rimson and Gus Isidore, who's the guitarist with Seal. He did. There's these other tracks, that are far more interesting than some of the things he chose to include.
How much? Well, Lawrence Archer had a comment. I'm wondering how much of you think of what he said was true. He said that Phil was too much of a risk because of his reputation with the drugs and the alcohol. So record companies felt maybe he was too much of a risk to bring in. How much did that affect his solo career, do you think?
You could look at that a couple of different ways. I've no doubt he became very, very difficult to manage. His own manager, I suppose, he was co-managed by Chris O'Donnell and Chris Morrison. Chris O'Donnell, I think, left around the time of the Renegade album or thereabouts. I would think Phil essentially tried to manage the band himself, with that wasn't ever going to be the right way to go. You could also say, in terms of his behavior, his reputation, was he reliable? Some band members would, that kind of talk gets around in what is, essentially a small industry. If you're meant to be turning up at 2 p.m, you're getting there at 12 at night. That type of thing gets out. Depending on how he was being, well, what if he was writing quality songs like, The Boys Back in Town or Emerald in 1984 or 85? Would labels have cared? I always kind of think, is it the material or is it him? A combination of the material and him. Maybe if the Strongs were strong enough or stronger than what they were, they wouldn't have given a damn. They would have, taken them on. But, Grand Slam songs are, they're not fully developed. They're very good demos. I kind of mentioned that in the book. I'm not really sure. Like 19 was later chosen as a single. I don't particularly like the song. That the same guy wrote the lyrics to The Boys Are Back in Town and also wrote the lyrics to 19 is, that's a big drop off. But then, Freddie Mercury wrote Bohemian Rhapsody, but he also wrote a song called Stop All the Fighting. And if you've heard that,
Which album is that off of?
Stop All the Fighting was a B-side to one of Freddie's solo songs.
Yeah, I don't think I've ever heard it.
I think it might have been the B-side to a reissue of the Great Pretender single. It's an outtake from his solo album from 1985. All jokes aside, they can't all be classics, but that's a big drop off. There's a couple of interesting Grand Slam songs. I always got quite liked, well, quite a lot of them, but I'd struggle to say that's a single or that's a single, but they weren't together long enough.
He was just 36 when he died, January 4th, 1986. He had overdosed a few days before Christmas. He did survive, but the damage was immense. The self-abuse inflicted over the past 10 years was now falling due. What do you think Philip Lynott would have done if he were able to beat those demons with his music, his poetry, and beyond? What do you think he would have accomplished?
He was after signing a record deal, so he was edging towards having enough material to do a third solo album. But that was with Polydor. You'd have to say he kept going to the very, like he made a video out in California for the 19 song. He's out in the desert, bikers desert, Men and Machines, I think was the video concept. He doesn't look well at all. But he did that I think they did that video November 1st and 2nd, 1985, thereabouts.
Wow, so that's days, weeks before
Yeah, I mean, but then he got on the promotional treadmill for, they did more filming back in England because there was parts that were not completed on that video shoot, so they did more back in London. I think the video was released. The turnaround time in these things was fairly quick back then, and the single was issued in the middle of November. He went on the promo trail. He was in Europe and England. He did his last TV performance in the middle of December. And about, I don't know, 6 days later, he headed to hospital. You know, so he kept on going and going and going. Just didn't stop.
Too bad. Yeah, just great talent. And as the years went by, I think more and more people recognized it. And what there's a statue in his honor in
Yeah, it
Ireland.
was at that. I remember being, geez, that's 20 years ago. But it was kind of summertime, lovely day, huge crowd.
It's in Dublin, right?
It's in Dublin. There's that famous video that Phil did for his song, a solo song, Old Town, it's called, and he's walking around various parts of Dublin. It's just up. There's a sequence in that video. It's Grafton Street. It's a shopping, it's a popular shopping area in Dublin. You have essentially a sequence in the video, and he's walking down the street and just being acknowledged by Dubliners. I think this was filmed in 1982, so it's just off that street. It's down a little side street, but it's and it's outside a pub, kind of a pub actually that would have been popular back in the day. I can't remember the name of it back then, but it's a pub that is obviously actively associated with the band now since the statue.
We didn't mention Phil as a person a whole lot in this episode, but I want to mention something that at the end of the book, there's some great comments in
Yeah.
the coda of the book that speak to Phil as a person. One was his flatmate Tex Reed,
Mm.
who said he had no idea that Phil would call his mother every 5 or 6 weeks just to let her know your son's doing okay. Just want to let you know. That was
Yeah.
cool. He
Yeah,
found that out later after
it is. Yeah. I
after Phil
believe
passed. His mother told him that.
Yeah, because Tex kind of lived with him for a while. He was a roadie. I think he was a roadie with Genesis.
Right. Oh,
Uh,
really? Wow. Okay.
but he did. I thought that was absolutely amazing because again, like I said, but he would have lived on and off with Phil in the various houses around London. I think he lived in 3 or 4 different places around London. But he did say that, and I thought, Jesus, in a sweet gesture. Because some guys bring home a lot, and some people bring home every day. But it's just one of those things, And he obviously wasn't that type of guy, but just to be considerate, I suppose. So yeah, it's a nice kind of story.
It seems by all accounts he just was a good dude, nice guy.
Yeah,
Didn't have I don't think he had a healthy ego, I think. He wanted people to recognize him, yeah, but seemed to treat people well,
he did. Like he helped out supporting bands quite a lot. He
right?
went whenever it's that type of thing as well. Whenever he had a gap in his own schedule, he wasn't. Particularly after he started. His kids came along and he was married. And there's that element of he was always filling in time with work. I do. Some people are workaholics like that. So maybe it takes time to see the balance that you need just to be good for your own head.
Like you said earlier, he started so early in the business, in the music business. I mean, he was just a kid.
Yeah,
That's all he knew. So,
yeah. Yeah. He was a teenager. Because a lot of people in Ireland at that time would have left school at 15 or 16 and gone straight out working. So you're talking about basically people born certainly in the mid 40s onwards. There would have been a trend for that. So and that's why a lot of people of that era did apprenticeships, and he was one of those. I think he did an apprenticeship course in the technical college, but he did as a fitter and turner. So would have been the job, in the plumbing area, I suppose. But he didn't take to that. Plus, he was earning more money from gigs than he was for the apprenticeship. Notoriously, apprenticeships here were paid quite poorly. But it's very different now. But if it makes sense, if he's earning more money gigging than he is doing that, and his
how,
heart.
how many kids did he have?
Phil had 2 daughters.
Two daughters. Have they
Yeah,
spoken about him over
but
the
there was
years? Are they private?
I would say that they're more private, but they did. There was a documentary produced It was called Songs for While I'm Away, and that came out. It was directed by Emer Reynolds. They're featured in that, and I think that was the first time I've seen them featured because there's been a few documentaries over the years, but they're featured in that.
How
Um,
much of a relationship did they have with him? How old were they when he died?
I mean, they were 7 and 5, I think.
Okay.
They were something around that. So I'd imagine, you have flashes, glimpses. You do, of course, you do. You're going to have flashes, I suppose, of being that age. It's been a while. I'm 48, so it's certainly what can as a 5-year-old. I have a
Yep.
daughter. I have a daughter of 5. I can't imagine the recollection would be much.
Favorite Thin Lizzy album and song? What would it be for you?
That constantly changes. That I've been listening to a lot of Frank Zappa in the last year and a half. You wouldn't know who you're going to get with a Zappa album. You know, in terms of what have I gotten? I had in the car. I had one of the BBC sessions. Lizzie did a box set, which is all a collection of their BBC recording sessions from mainly the earlier days through to maybe Jailbreak, but they did other ones as well. At a push, ooh, Vagabonds.
Vagabonds.
Um,
Vagabonds. And a favorite song, if you had to pick one. That's another one. It depends on the day, I suppose. But
because yeah, I love Johnny Talks the album as well. But Jailbreak is obviously, I think it's obviously the best album. In terms of song, With Love, I've listened to that quite a bit from the Black Rose album. That's another mystery actually to me. There's a video for that, but they never released it as a single. They made odd choices. I will say they filmed promos for stuff off Johnny the Fox, off the Bad Reputation album, off the Black Rose album. They made these video promos. Now these are very early days. They were state of the art back then, but they probably come off as a bit cheesy these days. But they made these videos and they never released them.
well, I realized how great they were when through the best of route. You hear the best of when you pop that at the time it was a CD. I'm thinking, let's see. I know a few of their songs. Whoa, this is some good stuff. I love the cover of Rosalie, Bob Seger's Rosalie.
Yeah.
Great cover.
It's and so many people think that when you can do it that well, that people kind of maybe don't recognize that it's actually somebody else's song. There's a few people like Joe Cocker used to do that. I think Joe Cocker used to sing, he interpreted so many different songs. He, to me, he just kind of made them his own.
I thought Rosalie was Thin Lizzy's. I had no clue. And then the cowboy song, the live version is great. The breakdown,
Yeah,
you
yeah.
hear that bass line. Yeah, it's just so many great songs.
Like for you, for like when about like did you once you become aware of Thin Lizzy, do you immediately kind of start getting into buying their stuff or?
Yeah, early 2000s. Just I had the advantage of working in radio. I had all these CDs available to me, and at the time you could burn them. And I had the best of one. It was a gray. I think it's a double CD, maybe gray cover, Thin Lizzy, the best of.
Okay.
So that was when I realized how great they were, and that's when I started to become more and more of a fan of Thin Lizzy's body of work. Prior to that, it was just what I heard on the radio, Jailbreak, Boys Are Back in Town, and that was it. Those are the two songs. That was it. Here in the U.S., rock stations would play those two, and that was it. So,
when you think about it too, Queen, think of Queen. I've always been a big fan of Queen. And, after essentially about 1984, they seem to relate Queen's kind of fall from grace in America to the I Want to Break Free video. They're dressed in drag. They kind of attribute that to, contributing to their lack of success or their dwindling success in America. But it's amazing that even for such big bands, that dwindling of success does take place.
Bizarre, because the same thing with Queen when Freddie died. I invested in the back material, and you're thinking they weren't pop because I wasn't old enough to really remember whether they were popular or not. Live Aid, I remembered, of course, but I heard all these songs from mid to late '80s. I'm thinking, man, this is great stuff. But Brian May did say he feels there's a good chance it was because of Freddie's lifestyle, being gay, that had something to do with it as well. The AIDS epidemic in the mid '80s but he did get his due, fortunately, when they had the tribute concert. And then it became, as right up until today, Queen is huge. Freddie's so respected. And I think, I say this so many times. Here's another great movie idea: the life of Philip Lynott. What that could do for his work with Thin Lizzy, bring it to a lot of people's attention if it's done right.
No, certainly for Queen, you've got these big hits, as you say there, for hits, maybe 5 or 6 years worth of hits that were hits everywhere in the world except in America, which must be mind-numbing for the people involved. But with the documentary thing, or sorry, the film, there's so many things. You know what? I'd rather see it maybe a series. They're trying to ram. Remember the Doors, the Oliver Stone thing, which was a bit iffy. Personally, I wasn't a big fan of Bohemian Rhapsody as a film.
You're
Uh,
condensing a lot into an hour and a half.
yeah, and they're messing so much with facts and fiction that seems a little. They don't need to. But anyway, like a 3 part or 5 part, whatever the case may be, whatever is needed. We're in an age now where that seems to be done. We're in a time that you have stories that are being told in very different ways that they don't have to go down the traditional route of.
Yeah, that's the next step. That's the next logical step, I think, if you get the type of producer and director that these films have gotten, and then have them expand it so you can really tell the story and do it in like a Netflix series. I'd be all for that as well. And of course, people can read your book, Philip Lynott, Renegade, which is out now in the UK through Sonic Bond Books. You can get it at burningshed.com. It was just released this week. I think January 20 is the US release date, if I'm not mistaken.
That's right.
So you can pick it up through Amazon and wherever books are sold. And where can people find you online, Alan, if they want to reach out to you?
I literally am on Facebook. Other than that, I don't have Instagram or any of that kind of thing.
Facebook is
Um,
enough. I got to look for that page, and I'll put the link on the show notes page so people can reach out to you if they'd like.
Perfect. Perfect. Appreciate that.
Alan Byrne, thanks so much.
And to you, Eric. Appreciate it.